Yeah, I remember that.
And then another day, it made us realize that,
They didn't have a certificate.
so they had to use that.
They let them start now.
Hey, you could start over time. But you could do flying dogs for a while.
All right, guys, good morning.
Good morning.
How was everybody?
Great.
Nice to see y'all. Just a lovely fall day. Can't beat it. Couple announcements. If you're not currently receiving my email, my reminder about coming to Bible study on Tuesday, put your email down on this little sheet right here, and that'll tell me to put you on our MailChimp list. I don't send it out every week, so if you sign up and you don't get it, it just means I haven't sent one out yet. A couple announcements before we begin. I want y'all to know about the Women's Fellowship that's coming up on this Thursday, 5:30 to 7:30, in this space right here. So if you're a woman, come in fellowship right here, 5:30 to 7:30. And remember, the men get together every Thursday at 7 a.m. once a month or every other week. I'm not sure, but Jeff August will let you know. 7 a.m. on Zoom and in person. They get together every Thursday at 7 a.m. And we have another grounds work party coming up on the 23rd. Hope you all see the progress that's being made out here on the monitoring of these cleaning out of these woods. Really impressive group of people that are doing that, which is very cool. You know, we want to get it at some point, and the city is up for collaborating with us on this. So you can see the cemetery as you're coming out here, and you can see the church from the cemetery, and then also from the street. It's going to be it's going to be really beautiful. It's about a 2-year project that we're just getting going. And you were blessed with foresters here at Holy Church. If you do ratio of employment, foresters very high up there. Landscaping people, landscape architects, foresters do a very high ratio. People who sell products involving timber, then it just goes, through the roof. But there's a guy who you may have seen in worship. He's got a very long beard, long hair. His name is Seth Hunt. He's married to Jen. They just got married here last year or so. He's a forester. He's really heading this thing up. He's a part of the tree commission, and so I got a lot of good ideas about maintaining these forests. And he told me he helps out with College Bible Study on Monday. So he told me last night that he just got a book from the Appalachian Mountain Club on trail management. So that's next. We're gonna have trails moving. So a lot of good stuff happening. I remember on Halloween, August 31st at 10:10, we're having an All Hallows Eve liturgy out in the cemetery, and then a trunk or treat in the parking lot for the kiddos who are going to be wearing costumes. We need people who are willing to stand at the back of their tailgate or their trunk and hand out candy. So all you do is you show up, you park where the parking attendants tell you in the back of the place, and you hold out candy for the kids to come through. So if you want to sign up on the Wednesday evening, there's a link to sign up. We need about 25 cars to be willing to do that. So please consider doing that. Very easy to do that, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. And you'll have kiddos coming by getting candy. This is kind of cool. So we had there's down the street from us. There's like 2 or 3 houses that are very student heavy. They 4 or 5 students living together. And a couple of them came down last Sunday. We were out with the kids in the front yard or last weekend, and they're like, "Are y'all trick or treating?" We're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Okay, we're gonna get prepared." Isn't that sweet? Like these college students thinking ahead, wanting to get ready for the kids. It's pretty cool. Okay. All right. Before we dig into Mark's Gospel, I want to return to our weekly snippet from Karl Barth and read and talk a little bit about time again. I haven't driven enough people out of Bible study yet. And we may get there. I had looks on people's faces last week like, I don't know if I'm going to keep coming for this. But something I had a thought afterwards. Whenever y'all have this experience in life too. You teach a class or you do a presentation. You always think about what you wish you said afterwards, right? And one thing I wanted to, that I was reading in Barth that I wanted to remind you of. And I say Barth, I'm talking about Karl Barth, the greatest theologian of the 20th century. I'm a big fan. He talks a lot in his theology about God was for us before there was a world, which is a simple idea. All the best ideas are simple, but it's revolutionary in its power. God was for us before there was a world, meaning that the cross of Jesus Christ and his coming into the world is not a do-over, right? It's not a rescue mission because we've gone astray. That it was intended before there was a world. So the Son is headed towards the cross before creation, right? So in a way, the act of creation is an act of incarnation, as God is bringing the world into being for the purpose of bringing the world back to himself. So what does that mean? We conceptualize time this way, and we talked about last week, right? Yesterday was Monday, tomorrow will be Wednesday. Next year, what year is it? Next year will be 2022. On down the line, right? Moving this way. And it's understandable, right? Because how else could we conceptualize it, right? We need to do that. But I want to complicate it a little bit based on what I just read in Hegel. And if you really want to kill the class, talk about the Lutheran philosopher Hegel. But what he points out, and this is really fascinating, is that time doesn't actually exist. It's not a substance, right? Time is how we measure decomposition. Think about that for a minute.
That's crucial.
It is. But it's also beautiful. So if we think about, if things were not decomposing, there'd be no need to measure time or measure the rate of decomposition, right? So time is dependent on finitude, right? No finitude, no time. Therefore, God is an infinite being and exists outside of time in eternity. So we think about that. Our experience of time is true, but it's true for us as finite beings. It's not true for God as an infinite being. So what if we keep this? Nothing wrong with this. Tomorrow is in fact Wednesday. As far as I know. I'm an English major. We can keep this. But what if we conceptualize the God's time or the point of creation or the nature of the cosmos as a circle which begins in God and then returns to God? Right? If God is for us before there ever was a world, God created the world in order for the world to return to God in a state of perfect unity and perfection. But this is so large, we have a hard time conceiving of it. So our little bit of sort of tomorrow is Wednesday, straightforward, left-right time, is within this great circle. But it's such a tiny moment in this great circle that we don't perceive the arc of it. Not unlike you can't see the curvature of the earth as you're standing on it. It's curving, but you can't see it curve because of our limitations. The same thing can be true in our how we understand our relationship to time and then God's relationship to time. And this again comes from Hegel. I think it's very helpful. If we think of like our lives as but a moment in time and but a moment of the returning to God that God is doing in the world. And it's not an inconsequential moment, right? Because our moment dissolves into the next moment, right? Into the next moment. In a way, these also could be like little concentric circles, turning into one another. You know, as part of what we do in our All Saints observances, we're saying all the moments of the past whose lives those represent have come into our present, have made us possible. And when we die, when we go over Jordan, our moment is then collapsing into their moment. And we make their lives, and then we make their lives possible. To me, it's very beautiful and very helpful. And this is, again, opposed to the sort of secular view of empty time. Right? Time is not at all empty for a Christian. Time has been filled with the grace and purposes of God. Questions, thoughts about that? Okay. What I should have said last week. Okay, so could have saved us a lot of time. Pun intended.
Jeff,
Yes.
I missed last week, so I don't know.
I missed last week too, even though I was here.
But the Bible puts us in time also. And you know, you always wonder as a kid how somebody could live to be 900 and something years old and that sort of thing. Or if the world was really created in 7 days, as we think of 7 days and all that, when science says differently. So, if we're looking at all of this through our lens of time, then does the Bible, how does the Bible fit into that? Is it just something written about the history of when those people lived? and how they thought things were? Was the world really destroyed by flood, or was that just something that happened right then in their time, in their little world? It's all a big mystery to me.
Okay, this actually is two reasons I thought this question is very helpful. And the first is in setting up my sermon on Sunday, so thank you for that. So I'm talking about Job on Sunday, right? And it's in my series about stewardship, so popular. Stewardship. We talked about the danger of possessions, the danger of egoism last Sunday, and this Sunday we're talking about the danger of ownership, the danger of thinking we're the owners of the world, right? And Job is a great story to remind us that we're not, in fact, the owners of everything. We're stewards, which is what stewardship is all about. But all that to say, I believe, and no one else has to believe this, and this is just Jeff, right? This doesn't have to be for anybody else. I believe that Job is a myth, in that I don't think there was a historical Job, right? I think, and I define myth as in a story that never was about the way things always are. And I think it's a divinely inspired myth. It's a myth that God thought we needed, so God caused it to appear in the scriptures, okay? Now, I don't think the whole of the Bible is a myth, right? Now, there are people who think that. The theologian of that camp is named Rudolf Bultmann, right? Would think of all of Scripture as a myth. I think Scripture is very complicated, and we have to read it in multiple genres because it exists in multiple genres. So when Paul says, if Christ has not been raised, our faith is in vain, I don't think he's speaking mythologically. I think he's speaking literally. I think what Paul is saying, if there's not an empty tomb, then this whole thing is not real. Do something else, right? So I think it's unfair to Paul to try to make that into a myth. I think he's speaking literally, but I think it's also unfair to try to turn Job into literalism. I think it was intended to be a myth. I think the rabbis who put pen to paper during the exile to give us Job also thought it was a myth, as they understood what the word myth means, which is a little bit different than how we understand the word, right? So there's two big camps of theology of word reading the Bible. One is everything is verifiable historical truth. Job lived, and if he doesn't live, it's a slippery slope into just throwing the whole Bible out. That's one extreme, right? Other extreme is, I don't know, it's all a bunch of man-made stuff. Take it with a grain of salt. You know, you can't really trust it. Well, it's pejorative, but you know what I'm saying, right? And I'm not being either one of those sides, right? I think it's a false choice between those two sides. I think we're supposed to read the Bible faithfully. Now, what does that mean? Reading the Bible faithfully means we try to actually engage with what it says as it's trying to say it, and let the Spirit do its work on us through what we read there. That doesn't have to work for you, but it works for me. Which is why sometimes I've been criticized as being way too conservative and way too liberal. Okay? That's generally how I know I'm on the right track. So that's one end. But also you brought up Genesis. Like Genesis is very helpful, right? And you also set up this thing very, very helpfully. I want you to go. This should be your homework. Go read Genesis 1 and 2, right? And read Genesis 1 and 2 with this heuristic, this circle in mind. And my bet is it's going to make an abundance more sense than if you try to read it with this heuristic in mind, right? Because can't you see, like, if we try to figure out was it an actual day, then we're trying to read this into it. But what if it's about this? What if Genesis is not actually about how to define the day, but it's actually about God creating the world in a way that the world is going to return to God? Right? I think this heuristic is going to help us as we read Genesis. Not try to fix Genesis, but try to read it like it was actually intended to be read, as opposed to foisting our questions upon it. Right? Every generation of Christians takes their questions and tries to make the Bible answer them. But the faithful thing to do is to let the Bible question us. Let the Spirit, through the Bible, question us, and then even change the questions that we're asking of it. And again, I can request a little from. I've been saying it for so long, I've lost touch. But it's really interesting that in most of our lifetimes, Genesis has mainly been talked about in Christian circles is this a supportive evolution or a not supportive evolution document? But that is the wrong question. Because the question that Genesis asks of you and me is, why is it humanity is incapable of accepting limitations? Why is humanity incapable of accepting God's good and gracious limitations? Right? And then how is God restoring, giving us gracious limitations in light of our inability to accept God's limitations? And then that connects you to Genesis all the way to Paul. I am free according to the world, but I'm a slave to all, right? I've been given limitations that are now free based on my sinful problem limitations that is an inheritance of my sinful nature. So let the Bible question us. So two answer the question. Lots of genres in the Bible. You got to get your genre right if we're going to read it faithfully. Then let's let the God and the Spirit through the Bible question us and change our worldview. And how do we transition from us reading the Bible to, in fact, God through the Bible reading us? Yeah, sure.
The circle in the linear, I think that's a life model, circle. God creates me, and at the end I decompose. And I can put a beginning and an end on it. On the linear, I can put a beginning on it, but I'll be darned if I can put an end on it.
Charlie, thank you for that, because again, that's empty time, right? I have a beginning and I have an end. But I want to point out how that's a false idea, right? You can say that my beginning began with my birth, but isn't that kind of a false understanding? Didn't my beginning begin with my parents' birth? And then their parents' birth, and all the way back to Wales, and then, and we're back to this great Kant Hegel stuff. Gosh, this is so much fun. Immanuel Kant pointed out to us that this is one of our big categories, causality, right? And it's helpful. We need it, right? Before, therefore, because of. We need that to make sense of the world. If we don't have that, we don't get to the moon, right? We need that. But ultimately, it's not completely true, right? Because generally, when we do causality, our beginning starts with our perception of something. Does that make sense? Yeah. Generally, the beginning of things is our perception, is our awareness of it. But our awareness is not really a beginning. It's actually our entering through our consciousness into something that was already happening without us. And that's Hegel's whole point. Right? That consciousness does not have a beginning or an end. It actually has an entering into. Right? A human consciousness enters into a universal consciousness. A universal consciousness. It doesn't. Nothing's really started. There's been an incorporation. Okay, let's dig into the Bible. We can keep going on this path for a really long time. And then I'll be up at night worrying about what I've said. But this is a great conversation. I love the offer of this. And I love to do this offline at any point. If anybody wants to sit down and talk about this stuff. All right, let's start with Mark 3:7. Mark 3:7. And Jesus, together with his disciples, withdrew to the sea. And a great crowd from Galilee followed. And from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and from Transjordan, and from the region around Tyre and Sidon, a great crowd that had heard the things that he had done came to him. And he told his disciples to prepare a boat for him because of the crowd, so that they might not crush him, for he had healed many people, so that as many as had afflictions fell upon him in order to touch him. And the unclean spirits, whenever they beheld him, fell down before him and yelled out, saying, "You are the Son of God." He sharply rebuked them in order that they might not make him known. Okay. I've misplaced a biblical maps. It's okay. The story. No, it's behind Bob. Okay, that's right. Okay. It's behind Bob. Okay, so we don't want to miss the geography that's going on here, right? All of this stuff is occurring in the north of Israel, in the Galilee. When he talks about getting into a boat, he's talking about the Sea of Galilee up here. But Mark just made clear to us that people are coming from Judea and Jerusalem. They're coming from Idumea, which is the state south of Jerusalem, kind of half Jewish, half Gentile. They're coming from the Transjordan, that means across Jordan into the modern day state of Jordan here. Again, that's kind of half Jewish. and then from the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is not Jewish. So what's happening is that a big confluence of people from the whole region is coming to see him. This is the first time that he's attracted attention on this kind of massive regional scale. And then the conversation which dominates so much of the early church, how do Jew and Gentile relate to one another, is now properly starting, because you have people coming from Gentile regions. Okay, it's a very evocative scene, isn't it? Part of what to me is so evocative about it is that the people are streaming to him and having a strong reaction to him, and the demons are having a strong reaction to him. And we can't help but think, you don't have to flip there because I'll read it unless you want to, but to me it is kind of it's a living out of Philippians 2:10. Sorry, should have it keyed up. Philippians 2:10 and 11. Philippians 2:10 and 11 is, God has highly exalted him, Jesus, and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Now when we read that, we should think exclusively about humanity, but I think every tongue in heaven and on earth, even the tongues of the demons, are going to confess that Jesus is Lord. This is the coming together. The demons are barking out, and the people are coming from him. To me, it's really evocative too to think about. Remember the last section we studied? The Pharisees and the Herodians are coming together to plot the downfall of Jesus. So he's in danger from enemies, from the Pharisees and the Herodians, but he's also being endangered by being crushed by his supporters, or the people who want to see him. That's Jesus' plight, right? He's assaulted from inside and out. It's the same thing was happening in the gospel lesson this past Sunday, right? He's being attacked by his enemies from outside and then manipulated by his disciples from inside. Remember when James and John said, Lord, will you give us anything that we ask? Will you give us a blank check? Right? He's being manipulated from inside and attacked from outside. And again, I find it to be really, really helpful, because when all of us discern a call to service, discern a call to leadership, what we want to receive is like accolades and garlands. Hey, man, you're out there crushing it. But that's actually counter to what our expectation of Christian leadership should be. If Christ is our model, what we should expect is opposition from the world and manipulation from our supporters. Right? But how powerful is that is, if that's what you expect and you still feel compelled to do it, then it's got to be God's Spirit leading you. Right? And not your own spirit. And it's not just Jesus. Remember, Moses had the exact same experience. Moses led the people of Israel whining for 40 years, all the way through the wilderness to get to the Jordan. Remember they said to Moses, Moses, it's because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die? So they're whining and they're even funny. They're even funny about it. Right? But that's, I need a daily reminder that that's the nature of Christian leadership. I need a daily reminder of that because I forget. I'm an amnesiac about the cross-shaped direction of Christian leadership. I'm a complete amnesiac about it. Okay. Remember, we always have to keep in mind that this is an apocalyptic book, which is strange to us. So we need a daily reminder that what's happening here is that Jesus is invading Satan's kingdom. And, we need a daily reminder, a weekly reminder that Jesus is invading territory that's being held by Satan. He means to clear the whole earth of demons. I was reminded this morning as I was thinking about this. Jesus is a Latinized form of the Hebrew Yeshua. So Jesus' name is Joshua. And that's intentional, right? Because if you think about what did Joshua do? Joshua crossed the Jordan and cleared out the Canaanite people, who were themselves vassals of the Egyptians, who had held the Israelites in slavery for 400 years, and through war created a kingdom for Israel, right? And all that is a preparation for the true Yeshua who is to come, who by a surprising means of violent war is going to create a kingdom of heaven here on earth, right? Just as and I actually, it's bloody and gory for our taste, and it should be. But actually, the holy war that Joshua prosecuted against the Canaanites is a pretty strange war. For instance, when he crosses the Jordan, he has all the soldiers of the Israelites be circumcised. Right? So they have to lay in pain for 2 or 3 days, out there exposed in front of the enemy. And what he's reminding the soldiers is like, we're not going to win this war. Right? This is about the worst strategy anybody can do. We're out here, we're exposed. The only way we win is if the army of God goes before us. Right? And I think a lot of that makes a lot more sense if you think about that's the preparation for the Yeshua to come. That's the preparation of what God's going to do. Yeah, Bill.
Is Jericho and Canaan?
Correct. Right? And think of what a strange model of attack. Right? To march around the walls and depend on God to break down the walls, the walls of Jericho.
I need a promise from you.
Yeah.
I want a really short answer.
Yes, I don't know if I can promise that. It's like Jesus and James and John, right here.
What's a demon?
What is a demon? Great question. I can't be short on this.
I'm sorry, y'all.
I wanted to know that.
Thank you. Good.
Okay.
Just don't think about it.
Okay. So let's think about how we can approach. Let's think about modern approaches to what a demon is. Right. So when we think about demons, the first thing we want to do is psychologize demons, and that's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing to do, right? Because we've learned a lot through modern psychology about what ails a human person, right? So we could say the people who were struck by demons have what we might call a psychological imbalance, or a psychological problem, or a psychological diagnosis, sort of so on and so forth, right? That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is these people were operating according to their own mythology, right? So the stories that we tell about ourselves determine how we think. Let's think about that for a minute, right? Like, do we speak language, or does language speak us? It's really interesting to think about, right? Because language confines how we can think, right? Because you can't think without language. So if you don't have the word for it, you really can't think it, and then you can't get any objectivity from thinking it, right? You can't negate it, so it has power over you. So if the mythology of your world is the problem I'm having is due to a demon, then that means that your experience is going to conform to the mythology of your world. Does that? And here's the thing, we do it too, right? Our experiences conform to the mythology of our world, right? We say things and do things that kind of conform to the spirit of our age, just because that's who we are as human beings. And we know that from kind of like a macro scale, right? When I talk to our college students here, they are very socially aware. They are very moralistic. They have very strong feelings about what ought to be done in the world and what ought not to be done. They care a great deal, which I think is good and has a kind of pressure that built up on them. So there's good and bad. There's good and bad to it. But if anybody knows anybody who grew up in like the Generation X thing, it was actually cool not to care. Right? You sort of worked hard to have a detached kind of vibe. That was the spirit of that moment. Right? So people's thinking and what they thought and how they lived conformed to the spirit of their age. That's what happens. That's what happens all the time. So this all demonology is not the spirit of our age. It's not our mythology. So we don't think in terms of. Now, I don't fully buy either one of those reads 100%, although I buy them somewhat. If a demon comes to possess someone, right? Wouldn't they screw up their psychology? Do you know what I mean? Like, isn't that the exact thing that they would go to attack, right? So it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be treated psychologically. They should be, right? But these things can actually be related without being opposed to one another in our thinking. And I think the language of mythology that we use to describe things, I think there are demons or things that are demon-like, negative spirits in every age that we use different kind of language to qualify, right? So there is no way to read your local newspaper every day for a year and not read about a crime that seems beyond bad decisions, right? It seems like the something called the father of lies, called the enemy, call it the accuser, call it evil, call it the devil, has duped someone into doing something beyond unconscionable, right? Beyond thinkable, right? And so those are our ways of describing the whole kind of host of evil spirits. And let me add to that. There are evil spirits within ages themselves, right? So you think about the militarism that swarmed Germany post-Weimar Republic into the development of the Third Reich. Had a demonic quality, right? And you could easily call it spirit. Maybe we don't like demon, but I think spirit still speaks. So all that said, summation of your question: is it a psychological phenomenon? Yes. Is it a mythological phenomenon? Yes. Is it due to the negative influence of a dark and demonic power? Yes. Is my take.
What about those pigs that ran down and jumped in the water?
Yeah.
They were demons, weren't they?
Well, they became hosts for demons.
Okay.
Because demons are incorporeal. They don't have bodies. They're spirit.
What about all these people that came in?
The demons are speaking out through them.
Okay.
In the same way that the spirit of Nazism is incorporeal. Right? You can't. Wasn't it wild that anti-Semitism morphs in every generation? Right? Like you can't weigh anti-Semitism, right? But yet you can see it take over people's lives, and it changes. It takes different forms, and it seems to never go away. To me, the most plausible explanation would be that there is a negative force in the world. But let me say this: I think that negative force is ultimately impotent in its ability to displace the power of God. I think to God and Christ belongs the victory. And so the idea that someone would be duped by the power of the devil is a kind of absurdity. It's not necessary. It shouldn't be. Barth called that the thing that should not be, right? Or that which should not occur. When someone attempts to put their little no against God's great yes. Is that helpful? Okay. Okay. Yeah, Charles.
Excuse me, you have stories along the way on the African bar about somebody wanting to cast out a demon, and the demon then possessing the person who was casting it out. Never mind. So,
I buy some of that. And the reason that I buy it is the same reason, that I think I've said it before, but that great Nietzsche quote about when you stare into the abyss stares back at you. Right? And then human history is also replete with people who battled great moral evils, who became morally complicated themselves. I mean, that's what the Heart of Darkness is about. That's what Apocalypse Now is about. And this is, I get this from Flannery O'Connor. But the devil is evil with intent, or evil with personality, or evil with agency. Was how she described it, and that's great. But that's about as far as we can go. About as far as we should go. Yeah.
That's put it simply as my grandmother used to say: when you get down in the ditch with a dog, you come up with fleas.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, it's pretty much the same.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Great question, and we'll keep.
Not a short list.
Okay, we need to be reminded about this. Remember, Jesus rebukes them in order that they might not make him known. There's nothing so ever counter to the spirit of our age. The spirit of our age is about publicity, right? Brand ambassadorship. What's your job? I'm a brand ambassador. That was a job that didn't exist 25 years ago, right? I'm a brand ambassador. My brother is involved, has been one time in minor league sports, and he worked for the Columbus Crew. And there was a crazy man who played for the Columbus Crew, played a little bit for the national team about 15, 20 years ago, named Frankie Hayda. Loved him, played left mid. He was like Scandinavian descended, long yellow hair, and it's just a wild man. And when he retired, he just kept working for the Columbus Crew. He just showed up at the office, shotgun beers with some people, go to the bars and hang out with people, and they got paid to do that. And so people were like, what does Frankie Hayda do around here? And my brother's like, brand ambassador. Fan engagement. be quiet. This is called the Messianic secret in Mark, and it's peculiar to Mark. You're not going to find it like this in the other Gospels. It's peculiar to Mark, and it has to do with his apocalyptic worldview. Remember, Mark and Jesus is invading the world and clearing the world of demons. And he's strategic and he's choosing his battles. He does not want to be fully identified as the Son of God until the cross and resurrection. Right? That's that moment. Now, he's not in control of that, right? People are saying that, but he's not going to self-identify fully. He's choosing that moment as his moment of self-disclosure, of the moment of revelation. Not the casting out of demons, not the healing, not the teaching, but the cross and the resurrection. That's what the Messianic secret is all about.
In other gospels, doesn't Jesus say, don't tell anyone I healed your daughter? Isn't that happen in other gospels?
It is. It's just like kind of the volume is turned down on it. So Matthew and Luke have gotten their hands on Mark. And for whatever reason, we don't really know, but like some kind of editorial reason, they turned the volume down on that. And we don't really know. We can guess at it, but we're not really sure why. But then in John, it's completely absent. Totally absent in John. Jesus seems unambiguous about who he is in John. I mean, Jesus in John is saying very early, unless you eat of my flesh, right, and drink of my blood, you have no share with me. That's in like 6. That's like chapter 6. Think about how different that is than the Mark of Jesus that we have here. Because the only way that makes sense is in a sacramental, Eucharistic, I'm fully God. Good context, yeah, Sarah.
My whole thing is this. It even goes back to music, like we have different kinds of music with which to worship God or have God revealed. And my mother used to, when I got involved in something that was a little bit more formal, my mother would get upset with me and say, well, you disdain my kind, and I do. It's just that God reveals himself in different ways for different means. So the Gospels, like I see Mark as just understanding kind of what he wants to reveal about Jesus through the Holy Spirit telling him. And each one has a different side of Jesus so that we can see these different perspectives and come to him in different ways.
And y'all, I totally agree. And y'all, we have an opportunity here to be very savvy Bible readers, okay? Very huge opportunity here. Because this freaks people out, right? And it's okay. But like the idea that there's a Mark in Jesus and a Johannine Jesus and a Lucan Jesus freaks people out. But we don't have to. And we can help the friends and colleagues and family who might be freaked out by just talking to them about it and being comfortable with it. So, our faith is in the God revealed in the gospel, right? The God of the gospel. Our faith is not in the Bible. Our faith is in the God that is testified to in the Bible. And it's a really important distinction, right? So if the gospel event has occurred, and this happens in the first few centuries, the first few decades of the first century, people are devoting their life to this message that Christ has died and then Christ rose again, all throughout the Mediterranean basin, and they're growing and they're being martyred, and this explosion, this revolution is happening, right? This revolution that eventually takes over the Roman Empire in 3 centuries, right? All that's happening because the gospel happened, that God came in the world and God died for sinners. Right? And what we have in Paul, and remember, Paul's letters predate the Gospels, right? We have a witness. We have a witness to that gospel, right? And we have Mark. That's the earliest gospel. We have a witness. We have a witness to that gospel. And then comes from Mark, we have Luke, and we have Matthew, witnessing to Mark's witness of the gospel and adding things to it. And then we have John, right? And then we have the letters that Paul didn't write. We have Hebrews. And all the Catholic epistles, the little, Jude, and all the little ones that go to the end. All these sources have come to being to tell people about the gospel, right? So our faith is not in them per se. It's in the God that they point to. Who is the God of the gospel, right? And a misunderstanding of this it's endemic in Christianity, right? This misunderstanding is endemic in Christianity. Now, I don't think the Bible is an accident. I think the Spirit caused all this to occur, right? The Spirit raised Jesus from the dead. The Spirit knocked Paul on his butt. The Spirit came to Peter when he was praying on the rooftop and told him to go to Cornelius' house. The Spirit did all these things. The Spirit sustained Mark's community as it's being persecuted, and then it writes down this gospel to begin with. The Spirit is doing all of this so that witness can come down to us. We can be in this room so we can know the God of the gospel. But our faith is in the God of the gospel. Our faith is not in these witnesses. Does that make sense? Because these are divinely led human witnesses. Questions off the bat. You don't have to agree with that. Although a lot of smart people do, like Luther. Justin. Now, there are smart ones who don't, and I'm totally cool with that, right? They're putting my cards on the table. But I think this frees us from the turning the Bible into the fourth person of the Trinity. Because when you turn the Bible into the fourth person of the Trinity, you pervert it in a way that keeps you from really enjoying it and relishing it. You spend time defending it or worrying about it, as opposed to immersing yourself in it, knowing that you actually can't screw it up because it's moving through you, as opposed to you trying to kind of defend it. Questions, thoughts about that?
Question or thought?
But it's the God of the gospel that we have our faith in.
What's the difference between my brother and what you did?
But the thing is, as we're having conversations, we need to be patient with people if they differ from this, right? Like, it's okay. But it's also okay for us to have our own thoughts on this, right? Like, we don't have to apologize about that. That doesn't make you sort of a loosey-goosey Christian. I think it actually makes people take the Bible really, really seriously. And actually, this helps really account for the fact that little discrepancies, right? The fact that the temptations of Jesus are in different orders from Mark to Matthew, right? If our faith is in the complete accuracy of the biblical witness, then that will be really unsettling. But if our faith is in the God of the gospel, come to us through his witness, and we're sort of going like, yeah, I mean, wouldn't that make sense? It doesn't seem like the order of the temptation is information critical, right? It doesn't really particularly matter what order they're in. Okay, let's keep going. This is fun. All right, let's do the commissioning of the 12. And he went up the mountain and called to himself those whom he himself wanted. And they came away to him. Okay, can I just point out how much I love Joel Marcus, who is our translator here? You notice how awkward that is? Called to himself those who he himself wanted. Right? That's not bad writing. That's intentional. Remember, Mark is not an eloquent Greek writer. Remember, Mark is writing industry-level publications, right? Like how to make a tent in the first century for fellow tent makers, which requires precision in language, but not eloquence in language. So this is so cool. Marcus has preserved for us the kind of inelegance of Mark's writing, which I love, right? How beautiful is that, right? That it's one of the reasons why I know this whole gospel thing is not made up, right? It's sort of this stumbling, inelegant, although efficient way of explaining to us. It's what a tradesperson would write. Anyway, I love that. I love that he's kept that for us, because understandably, because other translations are used in worship, they're a bit smoothed out. That's not a criticism, right? We don't want to stumble over our words when we're in worship. That would make sense. But we also need to have these translations that preserve the original style of this. And they came away to him, and he appointed 12, in order that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach, and to have authority to cast out demons. And he appointed the 12, and he gave Simon the name Peter, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, James, that's not Marcus, that's a typo there, James' brother, and he gave them the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. And Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. All right, this is cool. An apostle means sent out, right? Sent out into the world. Called out to be sent out. They're called out of the world in order to be sent back into the world. How cool is that? That's the call of a Christian. All of us have been called out of the world to spend time in the church, right? To spend time in prayer, to spend time in community, but not to stay there, not to rest on the mountaintop and then go back into the valley, to be sent back into the world, for the world, and to meet Christ out in the world. Called from the world into the basileia totheo, and then go back into the world as ambassadors of the kingdom. Having been so called, Christians live their lives with one foot in the world and with one foot in the kingdom. One foot in the world, one foot in the kingdom. Yeah, Charles.
just the word ecclesia means called out, those called out.
I love it. So ecclesia, that's what we translate as church. Church meaning called out. I love that.
I think it's kind of cool that he's sending out Judas Iscariot to be an apostle. I mean, when he knows that he's going to be betrayed by Jesus.
Yeah.
I think that's so cool.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful, right? He has foreknowledge.
Yeah.
And yet he's sending him out. It makes me think about, I was just listening to a great pod from Queen of the Sciences. You should check it out, some of this recent pod. And they studied a Christian revival movement in Germany led by a family called the Blumhards. And this was started by, in the late 19th century, the older Blumhardt was a pastor in a little village in Germany, and there was a person who was suicidal and beset by demons. And he worked with her for about 2 years. Right? And they tried all kinds of things. You know, that was the age of spiritualism and all this stuff. But eventually what he just tried was saying, it wasn't even laying on hands, just periodically sitting down and just praying. Simply praying. Eventually she was delivered from her affliction. She cries out, Christ is the victory, and that kicks off this whole revival. But it got me thinking, like, man, 2 years is a long time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But that would go to what Jesus shows with Jesus' Spirit. Look at the patience that he's showing and allowing this thing to work itself out. There's a connection between trusting God's providence, prayer, patience. These things are all knit together in a way that I really struggle with. That I really struggle with, right? I want to fix everything and make everything roll out perfectly at Holy Trinity. And here is Jesus, like, sending Judas Iscariot out into the world. I love it. Okay, so there's another thing I want to point out. Isn't it beautiful that the call to be an apostle is that they might be with him? Isn't that great? So the call to be an apostle is to have an intimate relationship with God, to be intimately with Jesus in order to be sent out into the world. And so in fact, our intimacy with Christ, our spiritual practices, is necessary in order for us to be sent out into the world. Right, in order for us to do these things. So my prayer life, my giving, my fasting, often the little things that I do, that we do, are essential for my work out in the world. There's a one-to-one relationship to those things. Marcus says, Jesus from this point is almost constantly surrounded by a circle of disciples. He does not exist primarily as a solitary individual, but as a being in community. And living the Christian life means being with him. Okay, y'all, this really cranks my tractor, right? So Jesus spends his whole early life as a being in community. And if we think about what is outside of the cosmos, what is outside of us, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which exist in a life of perfect unity, which Paul Henlicky, the guy that I studied from, building from some of Martin Luther King's theological work and sermons, describes the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as the beloved community. Right? The original beloved community. And what the point of this is to bring humanity into that beloved community, right? Into that life of unity that the Father, Son, and Spirit. And so community is how we do that. Right? And I love that bit. It's from one of Paul's letters, but it's at the end of morning prayer, where we talk about the fellowship of the Holy Spirit. Right? So that's a heuristic. It helps us know whenever the Spirit is really involved, it drives people together, right? And then when we're together, the Spirit is moving. Right? That's to me, it's really, really beautiful. All right, let's keep going so we can have time at the end. Or when we think about the 12, there's no way we can't think of the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, we're meant to think of the 12 tribes of Israel. And in Jesus' day, there was a hope, a prayer, a dream, that when God comes with the Messiah to restore Israel, they would restore the 12 tribes. There would be a restoration of the 12 tribes. Because remember, the 10 of the tribes get wiped off the map in the 8th century BC when the Assyrians invade. So probably there's only 2 tribes functioning after the 8th century BC. But there are people who remember their ancient tribal affiliation. Right? Paul says, I'm a Benjamite. Well, the Benjamites were wiped off the map in the 8th century BC, which means that Paul cares enough about his tribal affiliation to be talking about it in the 1st century. Isn't that shocking? There are no Benjamites. They have no territory. They have no chief. They have no council. but yet those families hold on to the memory of being Benjaminites down to 8 centuries for Paul to talk about it.
But Jewish people repeated stories over and over and over again, so that's how they kept them alive.
Exactly. The Bible became the means of memory.
Why they want to remove those, they didn't shoot
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, keep going.
yeah. That's a very good question. Okay, so the hope is there'll be a restoration of the 12 tribes. So when Jesus calls 12 disciples or 12 apostles, the point is, this is the restoration. Right? This is the restoration of the 12. And it's very interesting, right? Because the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the sort of rabid monks of the desert that John the Baptist associated with, they divided their community into a council of 12. Right? And they're hoping that there's going to be a restoration of the 12. Remember, Mark's gospel is a polemic gospel. And it's a polemical gospel saying what Qumran hoped would happen has happened in Jesus. What the revolutionaries of the Jewish war wanted to bring about by their war has happened in Jesus. Right? So we agree on what we want. We just agree on what God has done. God's done with that. Okay, it's a cool thing. I learned this. I didn't realize this until this week. Simon was a very common Jewish name. You know, it's like Mary. It's like every third female in the Bible is named Mary. You know, it's just like us. You know, we always have these popular names that kind of cycle through. But Petros is the Greek form of the Aramaic Kepha, rock, which doesn't seem to be a proper name before Simon Peter. Right? So Peter becomes a proper name because of Simon Peter. For Peter, it was a nickname like Rocky. Right? So Jesus is giving him a nickname. Rocky. Now, why is he doing that? I think he may be poking fun. We almost never want Jesus to be funny. But he would have had to be. Have you ever been around a captivating speaker who wasn't funny? It's part of how it works. Right? So I think part of what he's calling is that Peter is like rocky ground, where the Spirit has to throw the seed of the gospel on a lot. Because it keeps sprouting up and then dying. Right? Think of Peter's all failures, Peter's mistakes. And it doesn't even stop with the resurrection. Right? Remember, Peter goes gangbusters. He baptizes Cornelius in Acts 10. The Gentiles are a part of this. And then he and Paul have a big beef because when Peter's in Antioch, he's a little nervous about it, and he starts to associate with a group of people who don't want the Gentiles to be fully in. Right? And so he and Paul have this big boigus. Right? So you see, Peter is kind of always going backward and forward, right? So maybe Jesus is joking with him and giving him this name. Also, it's doubly funny because Jesus says to him, "You are the rock upon which I will build my church," which is a joke in itself. Right? Isn't it funny? Like, if you're going to pick a disciple to build the church on, why would you pick Peter unless you're saying he's actually built upon what God is doing with fickle, sinful humanity? Not perfect people, but fickle, sinful humanity. It's beautiful. But also think about this. Peter has also becomes one of the pillars of the church in Jerusalem, so it could have something to do with that. Again, we never let Jesus be funny. I think he's funny lots of times. I actually think the camel through the eye of the needle is probably like a first century joke that we lose from translation to translation to translation. Like remember the butt of the camel through the eye of the needle is the rich young ruler, right? And so part of what Jesus is saying is that, like, isn't it funny how complicated rich people make it? He's like, literally, come and follow me. It's not a complicated instruction, unless you're rich and it's really complicated. Like, I think it's a first century joke, right? I mean, it's serious. All joking is serious, as we know. But I think we never give them the same thing for that we want to go to the speck in our neighbor's eye, but leave the log in our own eye. That's probably the seeds of a first century joke going on with those things. There's another joke in there too. Boanerges, sons of thunder. Do you remember later on in Matthew's gospel when James and John go to a village they're not received by the Samaritans, and then they say, "Jesus, we want to throw down thunder upon them." They're not getting it yet. And so Jesus calls them sons of thunder, which I think is hilarious. Right? He's calling them like hotheads. Okay? But Peter, James, and John, they form the inner circle of the 12. We're going to see that later. And then this is a cool thing. And this goes to our talking about how these are witnesses to the God of the gospel. It's not really clear what Iscariot means. It's a debated point in scholarship. Marcus comes down with one of the arguments that Iscariot refers to Jewish association with the Sicarios, who were Okay, you think about all the various slivers of Jewish life in the first century. We've talked about the zealots, who were like the IRA, the right-wing paramilitaries who wanted to throw over. Well, you would know from history, right? Like, one IRA was not like another IRA. Like, one Sinn Féin member was not one Sinn Féin member. There were those in the IRA that wanted to organize like an actual rebellion. There are those in the IRA that just simply wanted to kill British soldiers and British citizens whenever they got the chance to. And the right word for those would be terrorists, right? So the same thing happened in the Jewish world. There were elements of the zealots that were not strategically planning a revolution, just simply wanted to kill Gentiles, kill Roman soldiers whenever they could. And so it's possible, Marcus argues likely, that Judas is one of these associated with this most militant fringe of the zealots, what you would call a terrorist, right? We don't talk about that enough, right? Jesus has called a terrorist into his 12. Again, I used to say this for years and years, and I retired it, but now let's bring it back. We struggle to have Democrats and Republicans in the same church. In Jesus 12, you have Matthew, the tax collector, who was a collaborator with the Roman authorities, and you have Judas, who may have been a right-wing paramilitary terrorist. In his 12, right? He wants to bring the whole world to himself. We want to create clubs of affinity. He wants to bring the whole world, and we want us to settle into contrastive identities. It's okay, we always do it. Every generation of humanity does it over and over again, but we don't have to. And I think actually, in our own way, by the Spirit of God at our church, God has led us to be able to cross that divide in many, many beautiful ways. And I'm deeply grateful for that. Okay, can't ever think about somebody going up a mountain in the scriptures without thinking about Moses. Really, you can't even get near a mountain in the scriptures without thinking about Moses, right? Anytime we're around the mountain, we're thinking about Moses. But think about, too, how there wasn't, we have in our mind the 10 Commandments. This will be the middle part of the story. But when you read Exodus, Moses had to make a lot of trips up the mountain. There were multiple trips up the mountain. It's way more complicated than the story made it. And in one of them, he brings Joshua and he brings Aaron up with him as a kind of commissioning of the group. And it kind of bears some similarities to that. But think about this. This is really, really cool. Think about how we're talking about in our apocalyptic sense. The age of the law has come and gone. Now we live in the age of the Spirit. Moses went up and came down with what? The law. Jesus comes up, and what does he come down with? A community. Empowered by the Spirit. Right? This is now the age of the community, empowered by the Spirit, which is the next step, the next moment. We talked about time earlier, right? My grandparents, our great-grandparents' life was a moment which morphed into my moment of life. The age of the law was a moment that has now moved into the age of the community of the Spirit, or the age of the beloved community. Okay? Let me end there. Thoughts? Questions?
Have you watched the LA's on?
Oh, I love it so much. Huge fan.
Everybody loves it. It's line after line after line. Kind of reminds me of Leslie sometimes.
Every now and then there's a show that is just weirdly indexed to the gospel. And Ted Lasso has got many gospel moments. Check it out. Apple TV, you can do a free trial. And if you're like me, you can forget that you did the free trial until you get charged for it, and then you can cancel it. Or your kids can just get all the free trials. We subscribe to Noggin now. I don't know what Noggin is, but we subscribe to it. All right, we have a couple more minutes. Thoughts, questions? Yes, Phil.
Peter was a Greek name, and were any of the other apostles given Greek names?
Ooh, good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that, Bill.
Bill, what was your question?
See, he said that, so Bill, I'm not sure, this is a really good textual question. Bill is saying Peter Petros is Greek. So the kind of question behind it is, why is Jesus applying a Greek name to an Aramaic-speaking Jew? It's not clear. Jesus may have, in his life, have used the Aramaic version of it, but Mark, for whatever reason, has translated it for us. We don't know that, but that would be that someone's written a thesis on that. So we can kind of dive into that. It's curious, right? Like there's a few phrases where Mark keeps the Aramaic. Eva lema sabachthani. Talitha kum. Why does he keep the Aramaic? We don't really know. Some reason that was important.
He was mainly writing in Greek.
Correct. So Mark is writing in Greek. Jesus would have spoken Aramaic. So all this is coming through that. Again, right? I want me. I don't mind beating a dead drum or a dead horse or a dead drum beating a dead horse. I don't know what the phrase is. But if you think about Jesus spoke Aramaic, these folks wrote in Greek. It makes this make a whole lot more sense, right? Like it's saying like this has come through several layers, and the fact that it has discrepancies actually should be taken for granted, and I can actually appreciate how much unity there actually is. From Aramaic to Greek, all these people involved, different communities, how we actually can get so much theological agreement from these sources actually becomes evidence of the work of the Spirit if we approach it like this as opposed to the biblicism that we see so much.
How many of the apostles actually wrote it themselves and didn't have scribes do it for them as they told the story or as the stories had been told to them? And they wrote based on what Mark said or whatever.
Karen, great question. And there's been a lot of ink spilled about this. And maybe even some blood. When theologians get really hot. Theologians get really hot with one another, Probably involving a pint or two. But part of what's remarkable about Paul is that in Paul we have a Greek writer who has witnessed Christ. Right? So it's coming, Christ met him on the road to Damascus, and he can write in Greek from what he sees. So we have Paul kind of from the source. A lot of argument about would Peter have had it in Greek, right? We know Marcus had Greek, but where is Mark's account coming from, right? Is it influenced by Paul? It's obviously coming from primary sources, but in what form? And the simple answer is that we don't know. We just don't know how that would have worked. To me, and this is just my own little pet theory because I got it from Marcus and some other smart people, is that Peter hands down a big chunk of this that finds its way into this stream of things, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it's Peter's death that creates the crisis for putting it down to paper. It's just one of my thoughts on that, right? Because we just know from human history that's just kind of how it works, right? Like how many times in your family do we think like we need to record our patriarch or our matriarch stories before they pass on, right? So I tend to think people who wrote Greek took it from the first-hand account of people who likely didn't. Is kind of how it works.
And a lot of languages have words that aren't translatable into another language too, so you have to sort of search for the closest match sometimes.
100%. So I'm trying to read this Hegel study, and every now and then they just give you the German word because like it's not translatable. It's like didn't help me a lot. So I'm just gonna skip over that.
Wasn't Mark in a hurry to get this done?
Sure seems like it, which is what I love about it.
Yeah.
Why does Peter have so many symbols? Nobody else has keys and fishermen and shoes of the fishermen and, Peter just seems top of the crop.
Okay. We've got to wrap it up but let me ask you this. Peter and Paul's got a lot of symbols too. Although they're not as kind of evocative because they didn't. I'm going to try to be non-snarky. The Roman Catholic Church derived a lot of its authority from, say, the association with Peter, right? Which would be a part of the promulgation of those symbols. But Peter and Paul are the big personalities of the early church, right? So they're the kind of celebrities of the early church. They're the Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. The celebrities of the civil rights movement, and so they're going to have a lot more art iconography kind of stuff because they're just the biggest personalities. So great question. Are we getting there? Okay, keep going. This is fantastic. Come next week. Next week is super important because Marcus thinks the parable of the strong man is the hermeneutic key to the whole of Mark's gospel. Okay, so read ahead to the parable